Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Amplify Your Business. Today, I'm talking to Craig Milne. He is the CEO of Copperstone Technologies. Now, this company is really cool. It's all about robots and hazardous areas that people can't enter. And who knows, we might even talk a little bit about space. But before we do so, I want to welcome you, Craig, to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, it's going to be really exciting because normally we're talking to entrepreneurs and founders of companies. Now, you are a CEO of a company that you didn't found. And so two partners started Copperstone Technologies, hired you early days before commercialization, and you are the one who have really grown it to what it is now. Then correct me if I'm wrong. Is that the right story there?
Yeah, that's spot on.
Okay, awesome. And so this is going to be interesting to talk to somebody who has come into a venture and is working with a couple partners and, just all the entrepreneurial energy and everything else that goes along with that. So to start with, I would love to hear your response to a twist on a question that I typically ask entrepreneurs. And that would be, what are three things that entrepreneurs should consider when they're thinking about hiring a CEO to basically run their company that they've founded?
It's a great question. Actually, I've got a similar parallel story. I've got a couple of friends right now who are technology experts, and they're looking into their company to hire a CEO. So I sometimes relate to them some of my own experiences here with me at Copperstone and what they should be doing right now. I think it's really important to understand what they're looking to get out of the CEO. Because I think that sometimes when I talk to technology-focused founders or early founders, there's a lot to a business that they might not understand. And so I think sometimes the attitude or the hope is that somebody else will have the answers. And so you're filling the unknown gap with an unknown person. And so really understanding what you want out of the CEO. And ultimately, the CEO has to have the ability, the authority, to control the direction of the company. And so it is a big move to hire into that role. Secondly, it's really important to understand why the particular candidate that you're interviewing would take on a job like this. And it can be a tough ask, right, as a startup CEO, because and especially in the early days, there's no money, there's a lot of risk, there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot to build. And so whoever you bring on board really does need to have the right motivation to carry the dream forward, right? So really trying to understand where that candidate's motivations for the job lie. And then it's probably also good, honestly, to consider, like, what happens if things don't work out? And I think it's Arnold Schwarzenegger that said, "Never have a plan B." But you do at least need to consider what a prenuptial agreement or what an offer amp could look like, because sometimes your vision just doesn't align. Sometimes things just don't work out, and so really making sure that you've got an ability to try each other out, and it doesn't have to be so serious as mentioning a prenuptial agreement, but I know some other people have basically tested out a CEO by engaging in a project. It's like, hey, why don't you help us write our business plan? It's a short project. Let's see how you do. Or help us create a pitch deck, right? And if a candidate CEO can do a good job, if you can work together, if you can spend a night in a hotel room together and get along, it's probably a good sign for the future.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you brought that up, because it is such a embedded person, such a critical role in any business, regardless of what stage the business is in. But when it comes to the startup, your identity as the hired CEO becomes part of the DNA, I think, of the organization as well. And so if there's a mismatch there, a misstep in that hiring process, that could really have significant consequences on the success of that startup and getting to that place of commercialization and launch.
That's right.
So now I'm curious though, in terms of like one thing that I noted down when you were talking was the right motivation. And so I know in a lot of startups, because the cash flow isn't there, the motivation oftentimes is share options or a ownership position, maybe really off the top. Would you recommend that being a strategy for other founders to consider when they're looking to put together that compensation package, because cash flow usually is always very dear? Or is there other areas or other things that you would suggest that they explore first before giving up some of that equity?
I think it needs to be part of a package, especially with such a critical role like the CEO. There has to be ownership in the business, and and a lawyer can provide the proper advice on how to structure that in a way that you're motivating and compensating someone to really have bought into the success of the business. But if things go sideways, you haven't permanently given away too much.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think there has to be lots of other motivating criteria for, especially for a CEO to join a company and for them to want to drive the success. I know for myself, for example, like me joining Copperstone was an interesting story. I had a friend who ran a mentorship program, the U of A venture mentoring service, and I was out for beers one day with him, and I said, "I'm going to start a robotics company," and he said, "Don't do that. I know these two guys, and you should meet them." And so that really was sort of my introduction to the original founders here at Copperstone. But for me, part of my motivation in my role now is both my past experience as an entrepreneur, but also just that curiosity that led me to want to start a robotics company and has led me down a number of rabbit holes in my own journey. So that's part of what helps me be successful in my role here.
That's really interesting. So you had a vision to get into robotics, and so that was a direction that you were wanting to go. So yeah, it sounds like a perfect match made there between you and the founders. And so let's get into that actually. So we've teased that there's some robots involved. So what is it that Copperstone Technologies does?
So we actually build robots for hazardous site investigation. And really, it started with my colleague founders were in university at the time. They were mechanical engineers studying robotics, and they had a project with a company up in the oil sands to basically deploy a sensor in an oil sands tailings facility. And tailings are the waste byproduct of mining and of oil sands operations, and really just a large, looks like a lake, but it can be really, really challenging to access, kind of peanut butter like consistency. And so they were trying to deploy this sensor, and they realized that the challenge was actually getting to the tailings. And so they bought a robot off the shelf. They're available on the internet, and the robot didn't perform as expected. Right, it got stuck in the tailings, and so they realized that there was this whole challenge around accessing the tailings, and so that led them to create a whole new class of robots. And that's really what began Copperstone, and what we're building on today is it's a special purpose class of robots that can access all types of environments: open water, soft mud, snow, hard ground. And that drives us today is building those robots.
Yeah, and it's fascinating the design of it. So for those of you listening or watching this episode right now, if you head over to copperstonetech.com, you're going to get to see what these machines look like and them in action. Actually, there's some great video work on it, but it's really a novel corkscrew tread system, I guess. I'm not sure how you describe it, but yeah, it seems very novel. Is that kind of the heart of its mobility, I guess, then, right?
Yeah, it's built around some pontoons, and so basically the pontoon allows the robot to float in water, and then there's a helical coil or a grouser, basically, that can turn, and so that becomes like a screw. And so in soft material or water, it screws forward and backwards, and so it can pull itself through mud or snow or water. But it's also can be a wheel on hard ground, and so it can drive much like a car would drive. And so we call that basically a screw drive propulsion system. And there are past examples, especially from the military, where they're playing around in swamps and areas like that. And so if you Google screw tank, you'll see a number of hits for some very cool looking vehicles. And so it is a kind of a design of the past that Copperstone has brought forward into the world of robotics, and we've patented that propulsion system as a robotic concept, and we're building our current fleet of technologies based around that.
Yeah. Well, that's really exciting stuff and super high tech. And I teased at the intro as well that maybe we'll be talking about space as well. And the reason why I brought that up is when we first chatted and I was looking at your website, it looks like some sort of alien planet that these robots are going across, in terms of these really strange looking landscapes of the tailing ponds. And so I was just teasing that would be an application that your technology would definitely apply to. And I think you said that, there's no reason why it wouldn't.
100%. We have a rallying cry around the office here. It's, robots on the moon. And that's really that it's both a rallying cry, but also there's a serious element to that. We eventually do want to get into space robotics, for a team of creative and hardworking engineers that we've got here, being able to build vehicles that could eventually get up into space and help humanity on the moon and Mars and other planets like that. That there will be lots of activity like that in the future, and there will be companies competing to be the best robotics companies in space. And we just think, hey, why not Copperstone, right? Why don't we be that company that everybody else is chasing? And right now, while we have the opportunity here on Earth, we can practice. We're building awesome, ruggedized remote robots in very difficult and challenging environments here. And we're gaining tons of experience and knowledge and intellectual property that we can transfer into space one day.
Yeah, it's really neat. So I'm curious because I think you said that you joined the company in 2019, and so there was no, it wasn't commercialized at that point. What year did you sign the first deal, I guess?
2019.
Oh, okay, so right after when you came on board, then it's
job number one. Yeah,
talk about performance. Yeah,
yeah. Honestly, it's funny. Totally detour here. I read a book a long time ago about the Brooklyn Brewery. So here we are talking about beer, but it was a really fascinating book. And a couple of guys wanted to start a brewery. And so what they did was, instead of like most other people, you go buy some brewing equipment and hire a master brewer. Yep. They actually started a distribution company. They started selling beer, selling other people's beer. Okay. And what they did through that was they learned how beer gets sold. They learned what was hot in the market space. And they started making money through their distribution company. And through that business, they learned enough so that when they set up their brewery, they knew what they were doing, right? And have your own opinions on Brooklyn beer or not, but as a business, it was quite successful. And that was one of those books that for me, I just read it and the light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, you have to make money first, right? We're, as a business, like we have to, we got bills to pay, right? And we have to be able to earn a fair profit for the work that we do. We're providing value to customers. And so even as early days as we were, and as complicated as a system as a robot is, the drive to make money very, very early, even if it's $20, right? You got to make something just to get over the hump of not making money, because that can last for too long in most companies.
Yeah, which again is that wisdom that a CEO can come in with, that a founder maybe doesn't have the same level of confidence or urgency or understanding of that, right? So, yeah, any other things, I guess, that you would say differentiates a hired CEO versus a founding CEO?
I think one of the things that makes Copperstone work is that I can entirely rely on and trust the engineering team to build what we need to build. And it allows me to focus on the business and the external world and on our clients and on growing the team, because really our product is complicated. And I do look at a lot of founder-led companies, especially where there is a technical, strong technical element to the product, there's clearly a need for the CEO to be able to talk about the product, right? And I have had to learn a tremendous amount about motors and gearboxes and geotechnical testing and all these things that we talk about on a daily basis with our customers. But the sort of the ability to separate the deep technical knowledge and building of the product from building of the company, I think is one of the keys that we've done right here at Copperstone.
Yeah, and it's really interesting you bring that up because I have a little bit of a parallel with our company, Amplify Media. So when I started that a little over 10 years ago, it was we were exclusively an animation studio. So we were doing just animated video production, and I have zero understanding of how to animate anything. I am not creative in terms of drawing anything. I could write the scripts. And I understood the strategy and the language that needed to be used to persuade somebody to, act after watching one of the videos. But that was all I had. And so I had to surround myself with people who had all those skills. And because I wasn't the cook, I didn't get stuck in the kitchen. And so I was able to work on the business side of things. And I think that there's a lot of value in that, in having somebody that doesn't really come from, in your case, all that technical background. You're smart enough to figure it out. You're obviously learning lots through osmosis and everything else because it's just you're surrounded by it, immersed in it. But it limits that tendency that founders have in getting drawn into working in the business as opposed to being on the business, right?
That's those are great points. And even sometimes the need for the engineering team to explain something to me, like when like it would be very easy if they had carte blanche to go and build whatever cool toy they wanted to build, they would do it. But if they have to stop and explain why they're doing something or what they're doing or how much it costs, because I ask those questions, then it does sort of put the brakes on some ideas or just change the priority of what we're doing.
I love that. That's actually a really insightful point because again, like the founders who come from that technical standpoint, they just love the inventing. And so they'll invent themselves bankrupt oftentimes. I've seen that happen for sure. Yeah. Really interesting. So I'm curious, if you had the opportunity to, write yourself a letter and send it back to you back in 2019 when you first joined the company as this hired CEO that came in, and obviously we talked about the motivations and so it sounds like you have some skin in the game in terms of some equity as well now. Is there anything that you would do differently as that CEO / now somebody who has equity, a partner, that would have been different had you known now what you know back then?
It's funny. It's like old tired advice, but I didn't listen to it, and I probably wouldn't listen to it if I wrote myself a letter. But it's the right thing to do. is to focus, right? There are lots of opportunities that come your way. The concept of good ideas are preventing the great ones from succeeding. And we followed a lot of things that seemed like good ideas at the time, right? Good opportunities come by, and they end up being distractions. And so I think if I were to either start again or write myself a letter, as you put it, it would be to really focus on a couple of critical goals. Like, what do we actually really need to accomplish by the end of the year? And to nail that, and to be a lot more okay with saying no to things that seem really important or seem really attractive in the moment. Just to focus down.
Yeah. I'm also really curious because you said that, you had an interest in starting a robotics company before meeting these two gentlemen who were founding this one. Now, what was the inspiration or the desire? Was it just because, you're one of those guys that it's just like, robots are cool, man. Let's get into this. Let's find a way to have fun with robots. or I'm guessing there was some other opportunity that you saw. So what was inspiring you to get into robotics?
It was, it was a little bit of all of that, to be honest. I was, at the time, I was running a company that did hyperspectral imaging. So it's an imaging technique that allows you to do chemical identification from a picture. And so we were talking about being able to inspect pipelines and sewer systems, and so my mind was starting to go into all of these places that are hard to inspect for the purpose of the imaging side of what my at the time business was focused on. And of course, it made more sense to inspect hazardous locations with a robot. And then, of course, like also being growing up watching the Jetsons and, a kid from the 70s and 80s and such, that, like, I love tinkering. I was just always a tinkerer. And so, robots are cool. And like, who wouldn't want to be in a robots company if you had the opportunity, right? And so it was just those two things coming together in my mind, the imaging and inspection, and then robotics. And this, if you go back to 2018, 2019, drones were still pretty new, right? Aerial drones. And aerial drones, of course, like, they're everywhere these days, and they will continue to grow in terms of their importance and function. Copperstone at the end of the day makes an amphibious or ground vehicle drone, something very similar, but different from an aerial drone because we can carry heavy capacity, heavy payloads. But yeah, I was really just that curiosity driven kid that wanted to play with robots and saw an opportunity with imaging. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's really neat. And like you said, I mean, who wouldn't want to, join a company that is doing robotics, right? That is really cool. And it's scary, like some of the stuff that you see out there. I know you guys aren't into those really weird things, but like Boston, what is it? Boston Dynamics, yeah, with those humanoid looking ones, which are doing backflips and everything else. And it's just like, holy crap, these are definitely futuristic looking. When it comes to, I like you had mentioned that you were a past entrepreneur yourself as well. And so I'm curious for our listeners who tend to be entrepreneurs, and we all have had those moments where it's like, man, I don't know, maybe it would be easier to go work for somebody else, or maybe it'd be better to have more people sharing some of the load, and so you get a little bit discouraged from time to time, or it's happenstance, it's the wrong product or wrong time or whatever the case might be. And I don't know what the background that you have in terms of your entrepreneurial experience, but what I'm curious about is just in terms of a lot of us entrepreneurs, we kind of start to self-identify ourselves as that business owner or as that entrepreneur. It becomes kind of part of who we are and how we describe ourselves. Was it difficult for you to step back from your ventures and into a situation where you're coming in as the CEO and not the founder in this case?
It wasn't actually, I didn't find that too challenging, to be honest. There is a little bit of sort of the, an imposter syndrome at the, the very early days of like, I actually don't know how the robot works. I don't know what it does. And so there's a tremendous amount to learn. And so that does feel a little bit weird, but in terms of like my own self-identity, I suppose, most of my, my friends, my social circle, my family, I've been involved in lots of strange and bizarre ventures. And so I think that for them, this was like, oh, just another one.
Yeah.
And so, I sometimes joke that, they gave up on me a long time ago, but, like I have fun doing what I'm doing, and they know that, and they know that, sometimes my work does get stressful. The hours do get long. I do travel and all of those things that anybody managing a small venture like Copperstone or a startup company, you know what those days are like, and they can be quite challenging. And also it can be quite difficult too, just from a social perspective. It's hard to relate to friends that have stable, normal type jobs. They don't quite understand all of the same nuance that an entrepreneur goes through. But luckily, there are lots of wonderful social circles now for entrepreneurs, and places like this podcast here, where you can come and you can relate and commiserate with other stories, and hopefully hear some inspirational ones too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're like an ideal CEO, like hired CEO. I think for all the founders who are listening right now, going, "Geez, I need to bring somebody in," because you have that background, right? You understand the struggles and the challenges and the sacrifices that have to be made in order to keep that business going. And in those early days, when it's just in this case maybe the three of you, pre-commercialization, you're at a point when like you have to act, you have to be the entrepreneur, you have to have that entrepreneurial spirit in that. And so that's what you would have brought to the table, it sounds like. And so it's a perfect fit. Yeah. I'm curious, as the CEO versus, in your previous ventures where you were the entrepreneur founder yourself, but now that you're the entrepreneurial CEO, is success defined any differently for you versus when you were wearing the founder entrepreneurial hat?
Probably not, to be honest. I think that, well, success has maybe grown in terms of its scope. So my first answer, probably not. Like, I think for me, I still really think that the biggest metric of success is just enjoying the journey, right? I don't have an end goal in mind. That might sound terrible for most entrepreneurs, but like I don't think about an exit. I don't think about a cash payout. I don't think about those things very much. I want to enjoy my day to day. I want to work with a team of super smart people. I want to do things that make me proud of the work that I'm doing. I want to be able to tell stories at the end of my life about, yeah, we put robots on the moon. Like, that was pretty good. Like, and so those to me are much more important measures of success. And I think the difference maybe between how I thought about things in the earlier phases of my career versus now is, like, I also recognize that, like, we have at Copperstone, we have 19 employees today and their families. And at the end of the day, I'm responsible for making sure that everybody also has that same enjoyable journey, and everybody's getting paid and everybody's having a good time. And that it's a responsibility, but it's also part of this reward when I can see somebody's actually happy and proud of their experience at Copperstone too. That's a good feeling.
Yeah, completely. And I love how you tied it back to the human element part of it. And it's just the experience that one has on the journey with all the people that are around you, right? It's so important, and something that we always have to remind ourselves of, because life is short, and really at the end of the day, what we have is the relationships that we build amongst the people that we're working with, and the other businesses and so on, and partners that we're working with. So it's neat. Yeah. So in terms of, people who might be interested in learning a little bit more about Copperstone Technologies or would like to reach out, what would be the best way for them to do so?
Well, we just launched a new website yesterday, so lots of new content to digest there. We've got an email address on there that's info@copperstonetech.com. That's always great. It's typically not too hard to reach me, even through the info line. Like, I always hear about contacts that come in, and so happy to have a chat. We do have a team of people here. We're almost all in Edmonton, and we want to be able to support the community here locally as well as we expand globally. So those are all great contacts for us.
Really cool. Well, and I can't wait to hear about, see that press release where it's Copperstone Technologies is now on the moon. I'm that is going to be really thrilling to see. Maybe a SpaceX conversation or something like that is in the works. I'm not too sure, but I look forward to seeing and monitoring how far you guys end up going, because it looks like you guys are one of those moonshot kind of companies that have the potential of doing some pretty great things and having some huge impact.
Thanks. We're working hard and swinging for the fences on those things. So
Yeah, really cool. Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time, Craig, today, sharing some of your experiences. And I'm sure our audience really enjoyed hearing the perspective of a CEO. And yeah, I'm excited to see where things go. And for those who are listening right now, if you really enjoyed this episode, you want to check out some of our other episodes, head over to amplifyyourbusiness.ca. That's where you're going to find the archives. And then, of course, any of your favorite podcasting platforms, just search Amplify Your Business and you'll find our future episodes there as well. So until next time, everybody stay prosperous.